Rising Sun Victorious. The Alternative History of How the Japanese Won the Pacific War. Edited by Peter G. Soros. Be careful what you wish for. The Plan Orange Disaster by Wade G. Dudley. Secrets abound in times of war, as does what Winston Churchill termed the bodyguard of lies surrounding any important military truth. Some 60 years ago, the failure of American, British and Russian military intelligence to penetrate Japan's secret stratagems placed the United States on the wrong side of the greatest naval debacle in history. How and why the United States suddenly implemented a version of War Plan Orange that had been abandoned as unfeasible in the 1920s is perhaps even more important than the story of the proud warships gutted by its implementation. From War Plan Orange to Rainbow 4. In the 1890s, American military staffs began to consider the Pacific as a potential major arena for international conflict. Initially, they envisioned Europeans as the anticipated enemy. One of the earliest plans called for the destruction of a weak French Asiatic squadron in support of America's own open-door policy in China. The joint American Army and Navy planning boards, for the sake of secrecy, and perhaps from the awareness that giving names to possible enemies tends to raise levels of international tension, soon devised a colour-based system for identifying nations during planning. They designated the United States as blue, the British as red, the Germans as black, and so forth. The acquisition of the Philippines in 1898 increased the emphasis on defensive operations in surrounding waters and necessitated giving consideration to the acquisition and protection of stepping stone logistical bases from the west coast of the United States to Manila Bay and onward to the resources and markets of the Orient. In the first decade of the 20th century, a new potential enemy emerged in the Pacific. With the Meiji Restoration, Japan had embraced Western-style industrialism and the imperialism which inevitably accompanied it. A modern Imperial Japanese Navy, modelled on the British Royal Navy, not to mention trained by that Navy, and often using ships built in British shipyards, played the key role in defeating Russia in 1904-5. The naval successes at Port Arthur and Tsushima established the Imperial Japanese Navy as a force to be reckoned with. In the eyes of American military planners, this impressive display earned Japan its own designation, Orange, and actions deemed necessary to counter future Japanese aggression in the Pacific could be found thereafter in War Plan Orange. The rapid technological shifts resulting from World War I, coupled with post-war diplomatic initiatives and the economic difficulties of a worldwide depression, dictated numerous changes in War Plan Orange between 1919 and 1939. In various guises and with the occasional twist and turn, planning moved from a determined direct defence of the Philippines by the American fleet in the early 1920s to the anticipated loss of those islands to a superbly trained, well-equipped and, thanks to its Chinese adventures, veteran Japanese military in the 1930s. By early 1939, Plan Orange called for the recapture of the Philippines after a 2 or 3 year methodical advance across the Central Pacific, at which time Japan's home fleet would be confronted and destroyed, allowing a close blockade of the home islands, hopefully decisive without the need for an invasion. In mid-1939, with war in Europe threatening to erupt at any moment, War Plan Orange was incorporated into Rainbow 1, a unilateral defence of the Western Hemisphere against Germany, Japan and their fascist minions. By mid-1940, a new plan, Rainbow 4, offered a multilateral defence of the Western Hemisphere, assuming alliances with Great Britain and France. This plan forbade any blue offensive action in the Pacific a clear acknowledgement of Germany as the most dangerous of potential opponents. In essence, the United States would abandon the Philippines, Guam and even Wake Island to a hopeless delay in action against superior Japanese forces. Rainbow 4 allowed Japan a free hand in Asia and the Pacific, while the military assets of the United States and its eventual allies knocked out Germany as quickly as possible. Japan, its options and planning through 1939. The industrialisation of Japan's economy may have saved the nation from direct European domination in the late 1800s, but it resulted in a quandary for the Japanese leaders. The home islands simply lacked the raw materials to support massive industrialisation. Thus the history of modernised Japan became one of aggressively seeking control of Asian resources. Through 1920, military success followed military success, yet European and American diplomats more often than not managed to strip away the fruits of Japanese victory. After 1920, the Japanese government became increasingly dominated by its officer caste, the same men who had found victory to be bittersweet at best. They knew a reckoning with the foreign tormentors could not be avoided, and the greatest threat appeared to be the United States, a nation with seemingly endless industrial might. Japanese naval thinking fixated on a victory through a single great battle. Before the technological changes during and following World War I, planners envisioned the American fleet being brought to battle near the home islands, as had the Russians at Tsushima. The United States Navy would be debilitated by its extended voyage, considerably improving the odds against a numerically superior American fleet. After the technological changes, the expected interception point moved south and east, its location varying with changing plans from the coast of the Philippines to the Marshall Islands. With the distance travelled less than a deliberative factor, speed, range and durability had improved dramatically. The Imperial Japanese Navy planned an attritional war against the advancing United States Navy. Submarines, land and naval aircraft and night attacks by light surface units equipped with the superb Type 92 long-lance torpedo would deplete the American forces by as much as 30% before the main battle fleets clashed and decided the issue. The timing and location of the final battle, as well as the success of the Imperial Japanese Navy's attritional strategy, depended upon which nation seized the initiative. If Japan struck first strike, the surprise attack being prominent in Japanese military tradition, it could quickly seize the American Pacific bases, the Philippines, Guam, Wake Island, and perhaps even Midway Island and the Aleutians, forcing the United States Navy into a protracted advance of 1 or 2 years' duration. This would allow time for the attritional strategy to work, but a danger, almost a certainty, existed that the United States production capacity would be so far in excess of that of Japan that the United States Navy would actually be stronger, despite a 30% attrition of its starting forces. Once it breached Japan's defensive perimeter in the Pacific, if the Americans struck first, especially with the Imperial Japanese Navy scattered across the Pacific and along the coast of Asia, disaster would result. Thus by 1940, as the Imperial Army continued to advance in China, Europe dissolved in flames, and the American people prepared to elect a president to lead them away from or into war. The Imperial Japanese Navy lacked a truly effective counter to an aggressive war plan Orange. Democracy at work. The Democratic Party nominated Franklin Delano Roosevelt for a third consecutive term as president in 1940. The Republican Party opposed the highly popular Roosevelt with Wendell L. Willkie, a major player in the corporate world, but not a man expected to win the heart of the common man still suffering from the Great Depression. It may never be known exactly who leaked details of Rainbow 4 to the American press, But on October the 18th, newspaper headlines across the United States screamed, "FDR plans to abandon our boys in the Philippines to the Japs." General Douglas MacArthur, caught unprepared by reporters that morning, inadvertently added fuel to the political fire. "Gentlemen, no American president has ever willingly abandoned an inch of American soil to an enemy, much less thrown away the lives of American soldiers and sailors. Our good president will be the first person to agree with me on that. In fact, I have so much faith in President Roosevelt that I would willingly leave for Manila today." The Republican Party knew a possible winning gambit when they saw, or leaked it, especially with less than a month remaining until the election. Hammered by Wilkie on the only issue available and with the polls only a week away, Roosevelt finally offered a statement to the American public via his Sunday radio chat. "I will no more abandon America's sons than I would my own children. The United States Navy is one of the most powerful forces in the world. Should, and I pray it never does, war come to the Pacific, the enemy will be met and destroyed in the Philippines." Somewhat reassured, voters elected their president to a third term, though not by the expected landslide. The day after the election, 3 things of note occurred. In Washington, American naval planners dusted off all copies of an aggressive Plan Orange to use in preparing a new multilateral war plan, Rainbow 5. In San Francisco, a vacationing General Douglas MacArthur received orders to take command immediately in the Philippines. And in his office in Tokyo, Admiral Izukuro Yamamoto, the man commanding the Japanese Navy, smiled as he read the news from the United States.